Hi, I'm Richard Campbell. I do podcasts, including .NET Rocks and Run As Radio, where we talk about software development, including an awful lot on open source. And for the next 2 days, we're going to be doing a whole bunch of questions and answers around open source and the work you can do with it. If you've never been involved before, if you're just taking a look for the very first time, you're in the right place. This is a jump start. And if you're trying to get up to speed on the latest, we're here to help you. And this is my first guest, Ross Gardler. Thank you so much for coming out and helping us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my name's Ross Gardler. I work at Microsoft Open Technologies Incorporated. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft, and we focus on interoperability between open source software and non-open source software that's not Microsoft software. We work with open source communities. We work in code. We also work with the open standards communities. And my background is very much in open source, hence me being here helping you understand just why open source.
Now, you have a close relationship with the Apache Foundation as well. What's that all about?
So the Apache Software Foundation is one of the open source foundations. We produce a lot of software out there, things like Apache Hadoop, the web server, of course, Apache Solr, and 170 odd other top-level projects. Those are the projects that we believe are ready for production. We have a whole load of others that aren't ready for production. I've been involved over there since the early 2000s, been involved in open source since the mid-90s. And at Apache, I'm currently the president of the foundation and member of the board of directors.
All right. So what's the difference between open source and me just putting my source code on my blog site, or just leaving it as a zip file, or putting it anywhere that anybody can get at it? Is there a difference?
Yeah, there's a huge difference. You put it on your blog site, by default it's copyrighted, and people can't use that material because it's copyright. They have to come to you to ask for permission. Now, you could, of course, say in your blog post, oh, you have permission to use this, but that legally is unclear. Exactly how can I use it? What can I do with it? So an open source software is where you use the copyright laws to provide rights to the users of that code, to the people who receive that code, and that tells them exactly what they can do with the code. So it tells them that they can read the code, they can use the code, they can reproduce the code, they can redistribute it, and they can modify it and further redistribute from that. So it's very, very important that you put a license on the code so that people know what they can and can't do with it.
So given I've licensed code now and I have an opportunity to use it, and this is becoming pretty common today. I talk about libraries like jQuery and Angular, those sorts of things. Like, everybody can grab onto that, but there's a lot of other open source code out there as well. Why is this a big deal? Like, what's happening that has got everyone so excited about open source today?
Well, it's not really about today. Open source has been around for 30 years plus, and if we go right back to the beginning of software development, all software was pretty much open source. We shared the code, we collaborated on the code. There wasn't any commercial model around the software itself, it was around the hardware. As the hardware became cheaper and more commoditized, well, that started to change, and we started to see proprietary closed source models. Now, what open source does is it says, well, look, there's benefits in sharing the code. And those benefits are that you can learn from the code. That's great. Certainly, I learned more from working on open source projects than I have done in education. But you can also collaborate with others who perhaps know more than you, or perhaps see the problems that you're introducing in the code. And the end result of this is that you end up with a higher quality code at a lower cost of development, because you're sharing those ideas and sharing the resources across organizations. Other benefits, of course, many people will say, well, it's free of cost as well. Actually, that's not necessarily true. You can charge for open source software. There's nothing to stop you doing that at all in the license. But you can't stop people from redistributing that software once you've given it to them. So it does force down the price of the licenses for the software. However, of course, the open source licenses don't provide any kind of warranty. So you can sell warranties, you can sell service contracts, you can sell service level agreements around that open source software. So there's still a business model there. We can still make money out of open source, and usually we make money in exactly the same way you do about closed source.
So this is more about not seeing source code as the asset? Because I think an awful lot of folks are hung up on this idea that the source is the asset. This is my recipe. This is what I protect. This is the 11 herbs and spices in my chicken, and I want to keep that a secret. What's my asset if the source is not the asset?
Okay, so there's really two answers to that. The source, if we say the source is not the asset, and that certainly can be the case, that you give away all of the source code for the product that you're working on, and in that case, there's different things that might be the assets. It might be your expertise, for example. If it's your code, you've written the majority of it, you're having some other people contributing to testing and things, you're the most knowledgeable about that code, you can provide the best services around that code. So that's one asset that you could use. Another asset would be the services that you provide around that. And as we move into a cloud-hosted world, for example, providing software as a service which is based on open source software, well, you can charge for that service rather than charging for the software itself. And then there's a more composite model between giving away all of the software where the software isn't the asset and giving away components of the software, but having glue code that plugs it together in a specific way to satisfy your customer's needs. So in that case, you still have software that's proprietary, but it's your asset. And you can go in either of those directions or any combination of those directions.
So if I have a fairly large project that a bunch of customers are using, I could open source pieces of it? Not just open the whole thing, but it's like this part is mine and this part I'm going to provide to the larger community to contribute to? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. You have to be a little bit careful. It depends on the license. There are different types of licenses. So there's those licenses that we traditionally call permissive, and you can do what you've described with those permissive licenses. Those permissive licenses allow you to embed the open source software in other software that isn't necessarily open source. And then you have what's called the copyleft licenses, and they are more restrictive in what you can do in many cases. Depending on how you use it, you have to open source code if you are reusing and modifying that code. So it does depend on what you're doing, and I think you've got some people talking more about the nuances of the legal situations later on in this session.
And this came along later, too. I mean, I'm an old developer, and I remember the hobbyist days where the idea that you would protect source code was weird. You published it in magazines, you shared it with your friends. That was a normal thing to do. But somewhere in this history, I guess things changed, that we started actually wanting licensing around source code. Were you there? Do you have a story around what that looked like?
Well, no, I guess the change really predates me. The change is maybe 30 years ago, when the GPL, the GNU Public License, was created by a guy called Richard Stallman. And that was really the big change in that we started putting licenses on this code to protect that sharing development model. The Apache Software Foundation, which is one of the permissive licenses and where I do the majority of my work, that came later. We're celebrating our 15-year anniversary this year. What has changed, though, more recently is an acceptance of the business models around these licensing models. So the licensing models are actually very old, and what's becoming more acceptable and more not acceptable but more understood is the business models that go along with those license models.
So, and you mentioned the Apache Foundation. Why do we have these foundations? Like, what are their role in this whole equation?
So, really, one of the things I mentioned about collaboration between the different organizations, and the license allows people to collaborate on the same code base even when they might be competing in the marketplace. And you can see that all over the place. There are many situations. If you look at the sponsors of an organization like the Apache Software Foundation, you've got Microsoft, you've got Google, you've got Facebook, you've got Twitter, you've got people who in the marketplace compete, but they collaborate on the code. Now, different foundations have different purposes, but one of the common purposes is to protect that IP. It's to provide a neutral space where that open source code is placed, where the collaboration happens. It provides the neutrality that means these competing organizations can collaborate freely within these neutral spaces that the foundations create. They also provide legal infrastructure protection for the developers on those projects, etc. Somewhere like the Apache Software Foundation, we don't develop any code at all. That's all done by people contributing to the open source. In a few other foundations, they do pay for development directly. An example of that would be the Mozilla Foundation, for example.
Oh, this is really interesting. I mean, there's a bunch of different foundations, so they've all taken different roles or approaches to how they... Is it ultimately, would you say, protecting the software, or is it giving it clear license?
Well, there's an organization called the Open Source Initiative, which is not a foundation, but they identify what is an open source license. So they have a definition called the open source definition. It has 10 points, and it says if a license covers these 10 points, it is a license. So the foundations don't usually choose, they don't usually decide whether a license is open source or not, but they do ensure that the management of the IP of the software going into those open source projects is sufficient and would stand up in a court of law if it was ever necessary. So that's one of the functions that they undertake.
It does seem to be sort of its own specialty as well. And I appreciate that it's separate from organizations like, say, Microsoft, Google, and the like, who all are contributing to open source projects, and I guess are, in some cases, competitors, but they have that neutral ground to work from. But it sort of speaks, I think, to a larger thing. If big companies like that can be involved with open source software, what does this look like, from your perspective, for software development in the future?
Well, I'd said earlier on that one of the advantages is that it's cheaper development. Mm-hmm. It reduces the cost of development. The idea of having other people or other organizations testing your code and working with your code, telling you what's wrong with your code is great for most people. I mean, testing's hugely expensive, even if they never give you a patch to fix the bugs. They might actually give you patches as well, which is great. Perhaps a little story about how I got in open source.
Sure.
Is a really good example of the future. I was at university. I was doing my degree. To pay my way through my degree, I was writing some software, and this was way back in the early days of Java. And there was no serial libraries for Java, and I was writing a magnetic card reader piece of software. Couldn't get it to work. I was using an open source library. Couldn't get it to work. Posted a mail to the list, described the bug. Next thing I know, the guy's offering to log into my machine and debug my code for me.
Nice.
And that's exactly what he did. He came in, debugged it, etc. I said, where can I send you a check? Oh, no check. You've helped me find and fix a bug. That's the future of software here. And I don't know who that guy worked for. It could have been a huge multinational, could have been a tiny one-man shop. I have no idea.
I guess the interesting part about software development in general is that we love writing software. Like, it's a fun part, and it's never perfect. No piece of software is ever done, right? It's like playing music. You're working on mastery, but you're only trying to get better. So the more code you write, the better you are, the more fun it is. I love that you exercise his code in a way he'd never thought of, and then you revealed a weakness or something that could be repaired on that, which he found beneficial. Like, he thanked you for finding problems in his code.
Yeah, exactly. He thanked me for finding problems in the code, and I always very careful to thank people who find problems in my code as well now. That's just one small part of it. When you scale that up, instead of one student guy working in the evenings to multinationals, you think how much testing, how much sharing of code there is between organizations like Microsoft, like Google, like Twitter, like Facebook, and pretty much anybody you can name these days. They're all collaborating on appropriate parts of code, and we're getting better quality code as a result of it.
Are you finding, and I don't want to put words in your mouth here, I find that there's a lot of developers out there, and I make podcasts, so I'm speaking to all kinds of developers, that they're the only one. Like, they sort of work on their own. It's kind of a lonely thing to be a software developer, to be a creator that way, that these open source communities allow you to connect with more peers and to ultimately, it's not even the code that got written, it's the conversations that I had around a problem that became the most valuable thing for me in understanding a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're not putting words in my mouth, but I think I'll steal those words. They come from my mouth. Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I feel I've learned far more from open source communities than I have in anything else that I've ever done. And that's because any company you work for can't employ everybody. And so there's always going to be somebody out there who knows more than you or can apply it in a different way, as we just discussed before. And you'll find yourself in these mailing lists with these people. And sometimes they're just other people like you. Other times they're the big names. They're the gods of IT. And it's kind of, oh, wow, okay, I never quite had it explained so clearly. And it's because these people define this stuff.
Right, and they've thought about it for a long time.
Right, yeah.
I mean, this idea that you're not the first person to think about this, that you can present a problem and have someone else who spent maybe years worrying about that particular issue and can give you a summary that just take advantage, stand on those shoulders, of someone who's really thought about a problem hard and be able to make a better solution for it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Stand on the shoulders is exactly it. Yeah.
So when you need to explain to the non-developer in the world about open source, do you have a short summary? How do you tackle what we're doing here now?
I wish I did. There is no obvious similarity I mean, we often talk about things like recipes, for example, where my boss, in fact, it talks about how you can take just 4 ingredients: flour, eggs, water, and whatever else goes. Sugar, that's it, goes in cakes. He's the cook, not me, obviously. And with those 4 ingredients, you can make such a huge variety of different cakes and different edible materials. And if you think of open source as being that kind of model, you take these small components, you plug them together, you mix them in a certain way, you plug them together in a certain way, and you end up with a better solution. Now, we then share the recipes. Now, of course, sharing the recipes in a book isn't making all these chefs redundant. We're not all great chefs. We're all good at 1 or 2 things within those things, and having those recipes helps us learn, helps us reproduce things, etc. And that's similar to what open source is.
Just an opportunity for everyone to get better and to experiment with some different ideas and collaborate with some amazing people.
Yeah, and improve on what those amazing people have done, and because you're applying it to a new space.
Right.
And so by taking a recipe by one of the greats and saying, wow, my mum had this great trick of, then you come up with something different, or applying it in an environment that you've got. Here at Microsoft, we have things like Office 365, and we're able to integrate these open source products with a great product like Office 365. Only we can do that. In terms of, well, that's not quite true. Of course, we've got the open APIs, but we have the people who know what those APIs are. We wrote those APIs. We have the skills, so we can integrate that, and then somebody else can then take that and improve on it in some other way.
It seems to me almost like it's the unique problem spaces you have. You know, what's cool about Office 365 is this huge number of users pressing against it. You come away with an understanding of a set of problems that a lot of us may not get exposed to. So I think it's really valuable when you can make that available to a larger community and actually show them, hey, here's the problem space when you're looking at this scale. And now we could try and work through some solutions so that when the next person comes along that has to figure that out, there's already thinking there. We've already solved it in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned what does this mean for the future of software development. I think that's a really good observation, that as open source business models mature and organizations begin to understand how they pay their bills for their staff that are working on it, you get more people working on those products, and it advances. And that's essentially why I came to join Microsoft Open Technologies. As a independent consultant for many years, I could have a lot of impact on a lot of open source, but I was one guy. Now I'm one guy with thousands and thousands and thousands of developers who are far, far better than me and already know a lot about how to work with these open source products. So leveraging those on the open source is a huge opportunity for me personally, and is an opportunity for the projects that I work with as well.
Awesome. Ross, thanks for kicking off our open source question and answer sections.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot.
And stick with us. We've got a lot more to come today as well as tomorrow. Next up, Phil Hack will be talking to us about the culture of open source communities.